So this is a general overview of the question of what is development. All of you are involved in political development. That is to say, the development of political institutions related to democracy, law, human rights, and the like. But political development is only a part of a much larger process of social change, which we call development generally. And so what I want to do is unpack all of the different dimensions of development and how they relate to one another. The term development really, I don't think, was used before the 1950s. And if you want to know where it comes from, it probably comes from biology. That is to say, there is a branch of biology called developmental biology, which is really about how sperms and eggs fertilize one another and grow into embryos and then fetuses and then become children, and then the children grow up to be adults. Now, that's a kind of metaphor to say that social development is like biological development because societies are seen to grow and change over time, but it is a misleading analogy in many respects because in biology you have actually a genetic code and you've got this sequence of events that unfolds pretty regularly in the development of a human being. And in the process of social development, you don't have a genetic code. There's really no underlying program that's saying that societies have to begin with, low-skill, labor-intensive industries and then move to heavy industry and so forth. I mean, there are certain regular patterns, but societies are composed of individuals, and individuals have opinions and wills, and they make decisions, and it means that the process of social development is not like a clockwork mechanism. I think we actually get that from Karl Marx, because Marx and the Marxists really did have this kind of mechanistic view that societies went through these different stages of development, and eventually we would get to communism. So what I'm going to do is try to go through what we know about the different dimensions of development. All right, so this isn't working. All right, I'm just going to have to flip this myself. Okay, so let's begin with the first dimension, which has to do with economic growth. How many of you actually started out as with economics training? Okay, a couple, 3, 4, okay. So if you talk about development in the development community of the banks, World Bank and DFID and places like that, probably 90% of the individuals involved will be economists, because development is very strongly associated with economic development. I think that we can give a simple definition to this, which is economic growth or development has to do with increasing per capita GDP, right? The output of a society per person. Now, there's some interesting aspects of this. So this chart shows an estimate by an economic historian named Gregory Clark of per capita income in England, single country of England, between the year 1200 and the year 2000. And what is really fascinating about this is how little development there was for the first approximately 800 years or 600 years of this process. From 1200 to about the year 1800, there is virtually no increase. And in fact, if you see that per capita income about the year 1400 begins to slightly increase in England, you know why that was? It was because of the plague. The bubonic plague came to England. It killed off maybe a quarter of all the people living there, and the rest of them got to enjoy the same level of income, and so their per capita income increased. That's not the way we want to increase per capita incomes, although it is actually a way that, it continues to happen in certain developing countries. But then all of a sudden, you have this shape like a hockey stick, that about the year 1800, the slope of the curve begins to increase very, very dramatically. And all of a sudden now, in a certain selected group of countries, you get year-on-year increases in what economists call productivity, output per person. That's the only way you get economic growth. If you don't have increasing productivity, you don't have this kind of growth. And that growth tends to get fairly evenly shared. And so Marx believed that, you know, you had industrialization, but the capitalists were going to keep all of that surplus. But it turned out that actually living standards across the developing world increased. This is another chart that presents data in a slightly different way. This one distinguishes between Western Europe and China, and it shows that in Western Europe, you actually, between about the year 1000 and 1800, you actually did have gradual increases as trade increased, technology changed, you got global shipping and so forth. But again, this very, very rapid change in the slope of that curve. But look at China. You know, China bumps along. It's actually richer than Western Europe up until about 1600. And then it goes through this big crisis in the 20th century because of war, revolution, occupation, political turmoil, you know, the communist revolution. And then, as we all know, for the last 30 years, more than 30 years, it's been growing for a large country. I mean, this is a really unprecedented rate of economic growth, all right? So what economists have to do is explain why that curve is as steep as it is. And I'm not going to do that because I'm not an economist. I mean, there's a huge academic literature on this subject about how you get to these high rates of economic growth. But I will only say the following, that in a lot of that literature, one of the conclusions that many economists, development economists, have come to is that the critical variable explaining that sudden increase in productivity has to do with institutions, that it's not actually an economic variable. You know, the economic variables are things like natural resources, population, you know, skills of the population, and so forth. But a lot of economists now will say, actually, what causes the slope to start increasing as rapidly as it does has to do with the existence of certain political institutions, state, rule of law, accountable governments, and the like, and that unless you get the politics right, you're not going to get the economics right either. And in a sense, that's kind of the problem of development, because this is another graph that shows kind of what one economist called the great divergence, which is everybody is bumping along at a, just above subsistence for centuries in the world. And then all of a sudden in the year 1800, not everybody, but a certain selected group of countries in Western Europe, North America, start growing. And actually, other parts of what's now called the developing world actually experience a drop in incomes, drop in per capita incomes. And that's kind of the development problem. So some countries are poor and some countries are rich, and actually that gap over time, over the last 200 years in many places has increased. And so we want to try to understand why that has happened, okay? So any questions or comments as far as so we'll open up the discussion in just a bit. Now, second dimension of development, and there are going to be 6 in the end, so, and you'll get all these slides as part of your materials from this course. So the second dimension of development is social mobilization. That is to say, social change over time. Now, this is probably the part of development that is the most vividly experienced by anyone that lives in a developing country and then makes a transition to a developed one. So, for example, in China, this has been going on over the last generation, right? People are living as peasants in villages in the countryside, and then at a later point, they're all of a sudden working in a factory in a big city, okay? So let's think about this a little bit, about what it means to say that society is developing and the kinds of social changes. So let's imagine, let's take, I've spent some time in Melanesia, which is Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, a number of places like that. These are probably the least developed parts of the world. And you'd characterize them that way because actually anthropologists love going to a place like Papua New Guinea because you'll see intact tribal societies where modern development really hasn't touched anybody, right? So everybody lives in a little community of maybe 30 to 40 people. They're all related to one another. They've got these very elaborate, kinship rules and so forth. And modern states really don't touch them. So let's consider that, and then let's consider, I don't know, life in San Francisco, big city right next to us, which is a modern, urban, high-tech product of a long period of industrialization in the United States, okay? So what are some of the ways in which the social nature of life differs between, this little community? You can't even call it a village, because in Papua New Guinea, they're not, it's just a bunch of huts out in the middle of the jungle, right? So what's the difference between what you imagine life to be like in that kind of setting and life in San Francisco? Let's just go down a list. So how's it different? And you can think about this and think about it in terms of, things like authority. How do people relate to one another? What are the dominant, forms of social organization? What are the, the social mores, the rules by which people interact? How do they differ? Yes?
The provision of public services are different, I guess.
Okay, so
education, health, and other
okay, so
issues.
So you've probably never been to Papua New Guinea, but what would you imagine it's like,
Well, I imagine that maybe in San Francisco there are like higher standards and quality of education and health than in Papua.
All right, so definitely, first of all, in the little village, who provides education?
Maybe themselves?
Chief of the
Right.
tribe.
I mean, a lot of times there is no public provision of these kinds of services at all, because there's actually no government, right? I mean, you can walk, way into the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and they've never seen a government representative anywhere. And there's a lot of parts of other developing countries that I'm sure you're familiar with. Once you get out of the capital city or the ports and places like that, there are rural communities where the government basically just isn't present, all right? So absence of government, but what else in terms of people's lives? So how do people in, this kind of rural setting, how do they organize their social life? Who do they talk to, or how do they relate to each other morally?
There must be someone who's the leader of the tribe that would always go to him for advice, or for even for him to organize their own life, and he has authority on them.
But what's that authority based on?
Maybe because he's the oldest or the strongest.
Yeah, okay, so there's some selection process, but I mean, how else would you describe the nature of people in this kind of society? Like, what's the main bond that ties them together?
Religion.
Well, it could be religion. I mean, in Papua New Guinea, it's ancestor worship, right?
It would be like
Custom.
personal ties, families.
Personal, okay, family. So that's the word I was waiting for. Kinship is extremely important. So in Papua New Guinea, one of the reasons that anthropologists love studying it is that they've got these lineages, where people trace their descent to a common ancestor, and that can be either a small group if you go back just to the grandfather, or it could be a much larger group if you go back 5, 6 generations. Every society in the world went through a phase of development in which kinship, according to these lineages or tribal groups, was the dominant form of organization, including modern Europeans. All the Germanic barbarians that overran the Roman Empire organized themselves that way. The Romans and the Greeks organized themselves that way, according to this. And these forms of social organization still exist. If you go to Taiwan and parts of southern China, you'll still see a ritual temple that's part of a kinship organization that links families together. Obviously, in the Middle East, you still have relatively strong tribal structures that remain in Kurdistan, in the highlands of Southeast Asia, right? So this is a kinship is a pretty important form of organization. So you move to the big city, and that is replaced by what?
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy. Okay, so this is very important. And what's the characteristic of a bureaucracy?
Impersonal.
It's impersonal, okay? So all of a sudden, well, it doesn't have to be.
Back in Bosnia, it's not. Back in Bosnia,
Yeah.
it's a combination
Okay,
between
so
kinship and...
yeah, hold on to that thought, because one of the big transitions that's got to happen if you're going to have a modern form of politics is that you set up this bureaucracy. It's a modern state, but sometimes hiding within that modern state is family, friends, kinship, personal connections, and it's not impersonal, right? And so one of the things that we got to figure out is how is it that you get from a form of organization, social organization, that's basically based on friends and family, to one that is impersonal, that treats people not because I know you and we've exchanged favors, or you're my cousin or my nephew or something, but get to a state where people are simply treated as citizens who have equal rights and equal access to the state. All right, so what else is different going from one of these societies to another? So you said kinship is replaced by more impersonal, at least that's the theory, by more impersonal institutions. What about the nature of, well, okay, let's just think about it in terms of life opportunities and just individual freedom. So where do you have more freedom?
In San Francisco.
Okay,
Well, it depends on how do you describe.
well, it depends on how you define freedom, okay? So in what sense would the life in the little village be, in a sense, freer?
The stress.
Yeah, okay, right? I mean, you don't have the pressure of a kind of modern industrial time clock. I mean, in fact, clocks themselves were invented during the Industrial Revolution. Nobody needed, in a peasant village, you don't need a clock because you just, sun comes up and you plant and, you don't need that pressure of time. What happens in a tribal society if you get into a big fight with your kinsman and you have some disagreement?
Family mediation.
Yeah, well, there's mediation, you can resolve these disputes, but in a lot of cases you just wander off. You say, hell with this, I don't have to stick around because, I can just take my family unit and move somewhere else and, these people won't bother us anymore, right? So in that respect, life is freer in that kind of a society. But what about in terms of your personal choices? We talk about a concept called identity, like this question, who am I? So in what society do you have more individual freedom to determine who you are? And let's think about this. So when you say, who am I and what is my identity, what are we talking about? So we're talking about where do I work, where do I live, my occupation, what kind of choices do I have with regard to whom I marry, who I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So what about freedom, in that sense, in let's say the tribal society in Papua New Guinea?
It's more limited, constricted.
Much more limited.
Yeah, the community is bigger than the individual.
Okay, so there's no state there. There's no tyrannical state that will tell you, you have to obey the state's rules, otherwise we're going to put you in jail, because there are no jails and there's no state. But in a certain sense, your personal choices are more limited. And so what are some of the kinds of limitations? What about marriage? Who determines who you marry? It's the family, right? I mean, there's tremendous social pressure. So you can't just fall in love with somebody. I mean, in Afghanistan, they're having all these horrible cases, where two people fall in love and the family, the tribe doesn't like it, and, they exact a pretty terrible, consequences.
In Lebanon, they started the other day cutting things.
Yeah, it was a bad story.
Yeah.
Can you please be more precise about the state you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're talking about the state with its three components, yes, we do not have the state there because there is no government.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk about the state, which is just a political and judiciary organization, which is very abstract. I think that there is a state in this.
Okay, so again, hold on to that thought because I'm going to get to the state. And I'm going to give you a very precise definition of what I mean by the state, okay? And at the moment, by the state, I actually have a view in mind that it is a hierarchical, centralized, formal structure that has a monopoly of power. And so in a tribal society, you have authority, right? There's a big man or a chief or somebody who is granted authority, but that person actually does not exercise anything like the coercive power that a modern state is able to exercise, all right? So there's always authority and there's always some degree of hierarchy. But in fact, in most tribal societies, they're actually pretty equal, right? I mean, precisely because if you don't like it, you can just move away or, take your family somewhere else. It's actually harder to coerce people to do things that they don't want in a certain limited way. On the other hand, the degree of social coercion is higher. What about occupation, right? Where do you have greater freedom? San Francisco or Papua New Guinea? Well, obviously San Francisco, right? I mean, you can do anything you want in San Francisco, right? Literally, right? Even more than New York or LA. But in a tribal society, first of all, you don't have any choice of occupation because basically everybody is, a farmer or kind of making, there's no choice in that. There's almost no choice in where you live, apart from, being able to wander around with your family group and that sort of thing. Okay, so in that respect, individual choice and therefore individual identity in the village is much more set. It's not set by a state, passing laws. It's set by a community of mostly your relatives and people that you know that exert a tremendous amount of social pressure and influence over you. So something like property, in San Francisco, you don't like you've got a good-for-nothing son, you don't want him to inherit your family business, so you just say, okay, I'm going to give it to some other person. Papua New Guinea, you can't do that. You can't alienate land, and in fact, for development, this becomes a tremendously difficult problem because Papua New Guinea's got lots of minerals. They're sitting on top of coal, gold, diamonds, a lot of things that mining companies want. So the mining company goes in and they say, okay, we'd like to negotiate to get the rights to the subsurface minerals in this particular part of the highlands. Who can we negotiate with? And it turns out that you can't negotiate with any one individual. You got to negotiate with a tribe that's probably got 1,000 members in it. And pretty close to all 1,000 of them have to agree that they're going to give up their land, and they don't want to give up their land. Why? Because their ancestors are buried there. Their graves are going to be disturbed. Their spirits are going to be extremely unhappy if this happens. And so the mining company says, so what the hell are we going to do? We have to find somebody that can give it to us. And a lot of the story about colonialism, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, has to do with this almost inevitably coercive and violent process by which modern property rights are, there's an attempt to transfer modern property rights into a setting in which private property exists and it's held, but it's held by tribes, by groups of people in which there's not a single owner that can actually transmit legal title to that property. And that continues to be an issue for development in many different places. You're from Sudan. Okay, so presumably this is also an issue. I know this because I did another class with someone from South Sudan who was trying to actually help the government figure out a new system of property rights. And he was saying that everybody's a nomad in South Sudan, and therefore even the concept of having fixed property is not well established. And so if you actually want to have the rights for a lease on oil and who gets the land and so forth, that just becomes an almost insuperable kind of problem. Okay, so this is something that's familiar in the contemporary world. All right, so social mobilization. So this is what we're talking about. There is a huge transition that is experienced by people that are moving from a village-level agrarian society, fundamentally agrarian society, to a modern industrial one. All right. And that has to do with many of the dimensions, the social dimensions. Oh, one we haven't talked about, women. So talk about the role of women in one society versus another, in Papua New Guinea versus, San Francisco. So what's the difference? I mean, it's so obvious, in a way.
They don't have equal rights.
Women have legal, rights. They can inherit property. Juridically, they're equal of men. What about in terms of social roles?
They have a chance for upward mobility here, but not.
Yeah, they can work, right? So they can get educations, they enter the workforce, and in fact, there's kind of a crisis for, among males in modern Western societies, because actually once women start competing against them for service sector jobs, the women do better, But most human resources managers would much rather hire a woman than a man if all other things are equal, because the man's going to drink and not show up for work and so forth, and the woman will be much more reliable and so forth. And so women are actually displacing, men in the workforce in many developed countries, right? So in a tribal society, sexuality is very strictly regulated. Who you can marry. You can't just go off and date anybody you want. And then in terms of female opportunities, they're much more limited, because the social roles are really defined, in a sense, by this larger community. All right. So this is a really big set of changes, and I think in a lot of respects, you have to pay attention to this social dimension of development, because that's where people live. I mean, the economic growth part is kind of an abstract concept, but this change from a village society to a modern urban industrial one is really a big deal. Now, why does this happen? Why is economic growth related to social development, to social change? And I think the answer was actually given by Adam Smith, the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. So you see there it says the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. This was the title of chapter 2 of Adam Smith's great book, The Wealth of Nations. All right? So in that book, the first chapter, he talks about a pin factory. He says in the pin factory there is a division of labor. That is to say, the old way that you made a pin was for one craftsman to sit at his desk. He would draw the wire, he'd put a point on it, he'd put a head on the pin, he'd package it, and then, there you'd have a finished pin. He says in a modern factory, one group of workers pulls the pin, another group of workers puts the point on, another group of workers puts the head on the pin, another group is responsible for boxing and then marketing and shipping. And he says, as a result of that, the output per person, per worker, is 1,000 times greater in the factory that has the division of labor, in which work is divided into small, minute individual stages. This is what economists call economies of scale, all right? But he says, why is it that you don't have pin factories, let's say in Papua New Guinea, right? And he says the reason has to do with the size of the market. Nobody has an incentive to set up a complex division of labor with a large economy of scale if you're only going to sell pins to your local village. There's no reason to have that kind of productivity, and therefore, modern economic growth is driven in the first instance by an increase in the size of markets. So where does the increase in the size of markets come from? If you think historically, think about European development, right? So the Industrial Revolution gets started around 1800, but before that you had a big commercial revolution, right? So where do large markets come from?
Colonies.
From commerce, right? And what is commerce in turn driven by? What's the size? What determines the size of a market?
The demand.
Population.
Well, okay, but population could also be a byproduct of the existence of commerce, because once people start making more money, there's more people and so forth.
Offer and demand.
Different products.
Well, okay, so people want to trade across international borders, but what facilitates the trade? I mean, it's pretty logistics, trade, yeah, and technology, right? Essentially technology. So if you can move goods from one distant place to another, you are going to increase the size of the market. And so what Adam Smith says is development in Europe really starts not in the interior, it starts where? In places near water. Because the main way in which you get to a large market is being able to transport things. And if you look around the globe today, where are all the big concentrations of power and money? Are they way inland, or are they on rivers and ports and oceans? It's the latter. It is still the case today that, in fact, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday. They're building a railroad that will go all the way from China to Europe across Central Asia, rather than putting the stuff on container ships. And so Hewlett-Packard is building this stuff in the interior of China, and they're going to put it on railroad cars. But they're saying even with that, sea shipping still remains by far the cheapest way of moving things. And that's why if you think about both historically and today, where are the big concentrations of economic development? They are in places that are accessible to communications, transport, trade, and the like. That's really the initial kind of driver of things. And that means, so some economists like Jeffrey Sachs have therefore said, well, that's a really big problem, and it's a constraint for landlocked countries, places like Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, they have limited markets, and therefore they cannot enjoy large economies of scale simply because they're not close to bodies of water or other means of moving goods. Yeah?
I was going to say 90% of the world trade goes through shipping.
Yeah. Right, and like your part of the world, like, Dubai and the Emirates, Dubai's wealth today really rests on its being a logistics hub. I mean, it's the fact that everything moves by container ship and, airplane through that part of the Gulf. All right, so it means that when you talk about economic growth, it really starts with increasing size of markets. Technology greatly facilitates the movement of goods. Larger markets then mean you can build pin factories, right? All of a sudden, if you need to produce 100,000 pins, you stop using this craft method of doing it and move to a division of labor where you've got a factory where everybody's got a very specialized role, right? And if you think about this in a larger sense, this was the impact of first the commercial revolution that begins in Europe in the 16th, 17th centuries, and then the industrial revolution that really kicks off in the late 18th and particularly the 19th century. It starts with trade, it starts with expanded trade, and then it leads to concentrations of wealth that permit investment in basically technology. Technology is really what drives industrialization. And then that produces a new division of labor. And in fact, one of the biggest concepts of classical social theory is about the impact of an expanding division of labor precisely on this. I don't know whether this thing works. No. So it really has to do with the way that economic growth produces a new division of labor and then produces new forms of social mobilization, right? So Karl Marx, if you go back to the Communist Manifesto that he wrote in 1848, it's almost a word-for-word exegesis of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He says, yes, modern capitalism produces expanded markets, it produces a new division of labor, and that new division of labor produces things called social classes. And so he says, first class that arises is the bourgeoisie. These are the townsmen that had been in an agrarian society. They're very few in number. They don't exist. But with the growth of capitalism, all of a sudden, you got people living in cities. They're not aristocrats. They're not landowners. They're not peasants. They make their money through trade or through investing in productive assets. So this is the bourgeoisie, the famous, oppressive bourgeoisie of Marxism. produces another class called the proletariat, which are the people that work in these factories, that are the result of all of these peasants leaving the land and moving into cities and working now in urban industrial settings as factory workers. And so that's the process of social mobilization that's brought about by economic growth. This is the classic story that happened in Europe, or at least in most parts of Western Europe. When you get into the Balkans and Russia, the story is a little bit different. It happened in North America. It is happening big time in China right now. I think now China is more than 50% urbanized, and it's scheduled to go to, like 80% within the next decade or two. So in China, there's been literally hundreds of millions of people that have left the countryside and gone to cities just in our lifetimes, all right? So they are experiencing precisely that shift and this shifting division of labor that is producing this new social mobilization, new social classes, right? So in China, now you've got a middle class that you didn't have before. People that are educated, they've got a little bit of money, they can communicate, using technology, they're connected on social media and so forth. And that produces very different kinds of, a very different kind of politics from, the politics of a basically peasant, agrarian, rural society. All right, so let me just.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how do you measure the economic growth of an individual versus the economic growth, the national economic growth, because in a country like Tanzania, you can see that the national economy is growing annually, say at a certain rate, but still the economy for an individual, it's difficult to note that.
Yeah. Okay, so I just gave a very broad definition of economic growth, which is output per person. But that doesn't tell you anything about how that output is distributed. And so it is perfectly possible to have a high rate of economic growth where all of the benefits of that growth go to a relatively small group of people and then kind of leave the rest of the society pretty much untouched. And this is particularly a problem in countries where the growth is driven by extractive industries like mining, oil, other kinds of resource-intensive activities where, a Western mining company, BHP or Billington or, one of these places comes in, they set up a big mine, it produces tons of wealth, but it only goes to the mine owners. It may employ a few miners, but, a lot of that fails to trickle down. Peru, Bolivia, there's a lot of cases where this sort of thing is happening. And so just the fact of economic growth by itself does not tell you, you need to know more in order to know what kind of social transformation is going to happen. One of the fortunate things that happened in North America was that in the period of industrialization in the late 19th century, first of all, property was fairly evenly distributed. And so rather than having large haciendas or estates, as in many parts of Europe or in Latin America, most Americans who were involved in agriculture had family farms. And the productivity took place on family farms. And so you didn't get these big concentrations of wealth. And it meant that you could have a more even form of social development. The other thing is that in many parts of the world, you get a phenomenon that is sometimes called modernization without development or urbanization without development, meaning that you get a lot of people leaving the countryside, moving to the city, but it's not because there's a lot of new industrial employment in the cities. They're just moving there because conditions are so awful in the countryside and they want to escape that. You get TV and, city's just a more interesting place to be, but basically they're still peasants and they still are living in kind of peasant communities with peasant, attitudes and so forth, even though they're living in a slum, in some large city. And that form of urbanization has very different kinds of political effects from the kind of classic urbanization that you saw in Europe, where they're basically people are being pulled off the countryside because of the opportunities for industrial employment, or like in China right now, where it's the opportunity of new forms of work that really drive people. But in many developing countries, you follow this other pattern where urbanization is just, it's done for other reasons other than the fact that you're industrializing. Okay, so this is just a review. I mean, a lot of classic social theory was about this process. It's really about the process, the integrated process of economic and social change that occurs as a country modernizes. So begins with Adam Smith, his famous 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. Henry Maine, an English legal theorist that wrote about the difference between what he called status and contract. So what that's all about is the fact that in a traditional society, your relationship with your employer or with a social superior is set by a kind of pre-existing social hierarchy, whereas in a modern society, you do it by contract, right? In other words, I take my labor, I go to work for Google or for Facebook, and I can leave anytime I want, at the end of the contract, and I can go, move across the country and work in a completely different occupation. But in many traditional societies, you cannot do that because your occupation is really set by the surrounding society, right? So he's saying having contract labor is one of the characteristics of living in a modern society. Émile Durkheim, a famous French sociologist, talked about this shift from what he called mechanical to organic solidarity. By mechanical solidarity, he was talking basically about a segmentary or a tribal society. So in a tribal society, you have no overall hierarchy. All the units are kind of identical to one another, like the segments of an earthworm, right? And you can grow the segments or they can shrink, but they're all kind of the same. And he said in a modern society, that's replaced by a single overarching division of labor in which you occupy a very small niche in the society that's part of a much larger, very complex division of labor that characterizes a modern society. Max Weber, well, there are other concepts about the different forms of authority. This last one, Ferdinand Tönnies, a German early sociologist, used these two terms, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, which roughly translates into English as community versus society. And what he's talking about is precisely that shift from an agrarian village society to a modern urban industrial society, right? And the division of labor is critical to understanding all of these things. And in fact, Karl Marx, so Adam Smith thought the division of labor was great because it raised productivity. What was Karl Marx's attitude towards the division of labor, this new division of labor that emerged in an industrial society where you all of a sudden had bourgeoisie and proletariat?
That becomes
yeah, he said it's terrible. It's terrible because the division of labor limits people. All of a sudden, you are not a self-sufficient farmer growing your own food, spinning your own clothes, raising your own animals, educating your own children. All of a sudden, you're a little worker in a factory, and all you do all day is put the point on a pin. And 10,000 pins come down the factory line, and the only thing you do is put the point on that pin. And he said that's terrible. That limits human possibilities. That's the source of human alienation, right? So he had a very different moral judgment about the impact of that. And I would say honestly that, I think the jury's still out as to which of these different societies is humanly, better to live in, right? So in San Francisco, you got complete freedom. You can do whatever you want, but is your neighbor...
You chain yourself by contract.
Well, you chain yourself, yeah. You chain yourself. It's a subject of individual choice, but you can still end up chained. But consider this. Where is your neighbor more likely to come to your aid if you get into trouble? Is it in downtown San Francisco or is it in the little village?
Little village.
It's in the little village. There's no question because the moral ties in the little village are much, much stronger. And I think one of the things that, people that, especially the people that make the transition from the village to an urban setting, and they do it in one generation, they feel a lot of nostalgia because all of a sudden they're living in this gigantic again, I don't want to keep referencing China, but it's been on my mind. But right now, the Chinese government is essentially taking big, peasant communities. They are buying up their properties, sometimes just taking their properties, building these gigantic apartment blocks and putting these peasants in these apartment blocks. And for the people that experience that, they may experience a higher standard of living if you measure their money incomes. But their lives are really different because all of a sudden they're living in this big apartment, they don't know their neighbors. If something happens to their children, they don't know, who to turn to, and so forth. And so this, so all of these guys in the 19th century, they're all writing about this in Europe. They're all reacting. So it happened in Europe and in North America, first in the world. So all these classic social theorists, they're all seeing the impact of industrialization in Europe, and they're coming up with these conceptual frameworks for trying to understand what it was that was going on, this big transformation that was happening in their societies. And they had different moral views about the desirability of this, because I think anyone would admit that, living in San Francisco may not be the height of human existence. I mean, maybe it's preferable to live in the small town where you know people, where there's more mutual social support, you know your neighbors, and so forth. And so there are trade-offs in this, in this process of social transformation. Okay, any further observations about this? So don't worry, actually, how am I doing in time? This session goes to when? 11:15. Okay, I've only gotten to 2 of the 6 dimensions, so we probably have to speed things up a little bit. Okay, so now we get to political development. So as I said, all of you folks are living in the political sphere, and so now we're going to talk about the development of political institutions and how it relates. And here I would say that there are 3. So the first is the state. So we're now getting back to the question raised by Birame, what is the state? Okay, so I promised you I would give you a very precise definition, and the definition I'm going to give you is the one that the German sociologist Max Weber gave. It's a very famous definition. So he says that the state is a monopoly of legitimate violence or coercion exercised over a defined territory. So there are 4 words in that are important. So 1 is monopoly, 2 is violence or coercion, 3 is legitimate, and 4 is territory. And if your social organization doesn't have all 4 of those characteristics, then it's not a state in Max Weber's sense. So the monopoly is important, particularly in Libya, in Somalia, in other places that are characterized by, militias and, basically private individuals or groups being able to exercise coercive capacity, right? So the hallmark of a state is that there's only one social organization that can legitimately take a gun and go up to a person and say, you got to follow my rules or else you're going to go to jail, right? And if it's a private militia that's doing that, or if it's the mafia, or if it's a drug cartel, that's not an appropriate form of state authority. And the reason for that is, people want basic security. And the best way to provide security, and I think one of the reasons that states first emerged, was that if you don't have a monopoly of legitimate violence, then you're going to have perpetual kind of war of all against all, right? So the state has to impose that monopoly.
So if there was an EU police, EU would become a state.
Well, so this is an interesting question, especially for a place like Libya, is what is the historical path by which a country characterized by private militias evolves into a state with a monopoly of coercion, all right? And, well, I mean, there's a lot of different, cases of that, and unfortunately, a lot of them are pretty violent. And so in Europe, it involved little principalities fighting one another, and then one emerges the winner, and they say, I'm the winner, and I'm gonna, I'm now the king, and I'm gonna, impose peace on, on my realm. Sometimes it can be negotiated, but there is this violent character to the state that you just cannot get away with, because in a sense, that's kind of the essence, is the state's ability to coerce people. With regard to Libya and Somalia, one thing to think about is the case of the Altalena, which was this. So this is at the beginning of the formation of the State of Israel. So Israel, fought a war against the British occupation authorities. They actually had several different components, including a group called the Irgun, which was a more radical Jewish nationalist group back in the late 1940s. And when the State of Israel was declared in 1948, they did not have a monopoly of power. And one thing that happened that was critical in the state formation in Israel was the sinking of this ship called the Altalena, which was it was basically a munitions ship that the Irgun had contracted to bring weapons to Palestine. And David Ben-Gurion, who was the first president of Israel, basically, when that ship entered Haifa harbor, he sank it. So this was a Jewish state sinking a weapons ship of another Jewish group, and the whole point of that was that at this point there is a single legitimate Israeli state. I am the president of it, and nobody else has the right, without the state's authority to import weapons, right? And so that's what's got to happen in Libya. I mean, at some point, all of the militias either have to be incorporated into a national army, or if they don't want to do that, they've somehow got to be disarmed and demobilized, and there has to be a single legitimate source of authority. So there's 4 words. So force, legitimacy. So it's, people broadly have to agree that the state has the right to coerce people. And then territory is important because states exercise power over, defined pieces of land. A tribe exerts authority wherever the tribe is. And so if the tribe wanders off, 100 kilometers down the river or something, it's still going to be the tribe, but states don't do that. They've got defined borders. Now, one further definition that's really important that gets to, I guess, the point that Abdurrashid made earlier, which has to do with impersonality. Okay, so the earliest forms of state are what we call patrimonial. And this is probably the single most important distinction I'll make to you this morning, right? A patrimonial state means that the ruler of the state treats the state like his personal property, right? So, and the state, the apparatus of the state is all the friends and family of the ruler, and kind of the state exists for the sake of the ruler. I mean, there's no distinction between the private interest of the ruler and the public interest of the community. And again, all states started out this way. In Europe, just as much as anywhere else. And one of the big hurdles in political development was moving from a state that was regarded as the private property of the rulers to a state that was impersonal, that believed that there was something called a public interest that was different from the private interest of the ruler, and that the ruler's obligation was to serve that public interest and to do it in an impersonal manner, so that it didn't matter whether you are related or a friend of the ruler or had some kind of personal connection. All right, so just going around the tables here, how many of you think you live in a country that has a modern state in that sense? In which the control of the state is, not a matter of kind of group of people that control it, kind of using it, based on friends and family, for their own interests. You think it's impossible for that to happen?
Of course, it's not. In my case,
Argentina, of course, is not a perfect state in that sense.
Okay, so there are degrees of
There are
this.
degrees exactly, but more or less, I can at least say that we live in a modern state.
Or when it comes, or let me rephrase, the smaller the city or the smaller the government or the less developed the area in which the government is working, the more patrimonialism there is.
Okay,
So what you found is small cities, it's full of cousins, brothers, nepotism, where the bigger the area of the government, the less that it is.
okay.
Yeah, for example, in Colombia, I think that if we see the country as a whole and we take off our previous president, we could see that we live in a modern state, with the exception in the national as a whole. But then when you see the region, you see a completely paternalism governments with the regional families or either the illegal forces taking control.
Right,
so
right.
it's very different from if you see it as a national level or as a regional level. So
So that's right, and in fact, Colombia is a case where the government classically has not had a monopoly of force over the whole territory. I mean, you got the FARC and, paramilitaries running around, that control different parts of the state. But certainly in the big cities, you do have something that looks like a modern state. So you have degrees of this, Emmanuel.
I was thinking that in most states you might not find an overwhelming influence of these shadow states created, but you might have few people who either in governance or in the economic sector or basically unscrupulous businessmen who might want to create their own leverage through using resources to influence state at certain levels.
So this is an important point. So I don't want to pretend that there's this sharp distinction between these modern impersonal states and patrimonial states, because I think there's actually this continuum. And when you get to the country like the United States, one of the big questions is whether our state is actually so impersonal, because one of the biggest, and we'll talk about this, we're going to have a panel on American politics, but one of the big complaints about American politics right now is the role of money in election campaigns, and the fact that certain interest groups exert disproportionate influence over decisions that are made in Congress by the president and so forth. And it's done in a way that violates this rule of impartiality, that not everybody's vote is equal, because some people can supplement their vote with a lot of campaign money and get their special subsidy or a tax exemption and so forth. And so I think every society in the world has a constant struggle to achieve this ideal of an impersonal state. And part of the reason I'm giving you this definition is not to say that anyone's actually achieved this, but it's what Max Weber called an ideal type. You need to keep this model in your mind. That's kind of what you're striving for, that you want the state to be impersonal, to treat people as citizens on an equal basis. Nobody actually does that, but some societies are much worse than others, right? In some societies, the rulers just don't make any pretense at all of serving a public interest, and they say, okay, I'm president, now I can loot the treasury of everything, and enrich all my brothers and cousins and relatives and so forth. And in others, there's a deeper sense of responsibility, a sense that there's a public good and that the state doesn't exist just for your personal benefit. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the United States is that, so if you want to get rich in the United States, what do?
Private sector.
You go to the private sector. Here we're in the middle of Silicon Valley. I would say of all the undergraduates at Stanford that we teach, I don't know, how many actually want to go into government? It's a minuscule number. Yeah. Everybody else wants to start a private company. Whereas in countries that don't have a vigorous private sector, that avenue of activity is closed off to you. And so how do you get rich? You go into politics, right? You go into politics because then you can use your influence and skills to get the government to give you something, right? And so again, that's another reason why having this impersonal state is important, because you want to protect the state against this undue capture by private interests or private individuals. And so, I mean, we don't have classical patrimonialism anymore anywhere in the world. So there is no ruler, no dictator who gets up and says, yes, I own this country and I can do anything with it. I mean, kings would do this in medieval Europe because they actually.
North Korea.
North Korea.
No. If you listen to the Communist Party in North Korea, says that they're ruling on behalf of the great Korean people. Kim Jong-un does not make speeches saying, this is my personal property, right? So there's a pretense that you're operating the state for some kind of public benefit. What's called neo-patrimonialism refers to the fact that in many countries you have a pretense of having a modern state and modern institutions, but the reality is that it's still run for the private benefit of the insiders, okay? And so when you see the term neo-patrimonialism, applied to a country, that's what you're talking about. That yes, there's a president, he's riding a nice limousine, there's a bureaucracy, there's all these public authorities, but in fact, the political rule is just held for the private benefit of the leaders. Yeah.
Azerbaijan.
No, I just wanted to share our experience in Senegal,
Yeah.
where we're doing our best to put in place a modern state, but where culturally citizens have the tendency to consider the president as the owner of the country. And he is literally called the owner of the country. In my language, the president is called the owner of the country. So citizens, generally, they consider whatever the president or the state is doing for them as a favor, because he is the owner.
Yeah.
So you see this, I think our experience is very interesting. The leaders are trying to be impersonal, to not use the patrimonial state, but the citizens themselves are not ready yet.
Yep.
So
No, and that's a problem because, I guess one of the biggest changes that happened in Europe in the 18th, 19th centuries was this growth of this idea of sovereignty, something that Steve Krasner has written about, but sovereignty connected to the sovereign authority was not just the ruler. The sovereign was the whole community, and the ruler exercised power legitimately only as a representative of that larger community. Ruler had his own private interest, but as the sovereign, he did it as a representative of the public interest. And unless you've got a very deeply rooted distinction between public and private, you can't even begin to talk about something like corruption. So what's the definition of corruption? I mean, most people would say it's the private appropriation of public money, right? But if there's no distinction between public and private, by definition, you can't have corruption because the ruler owns everything. So he's just playing with his own patrimony. Yeah.
I think the issue that Ibrahim is raising is a very critical issue when you want to look at how states have evolved, particularly so states like African states that were monarchical in nature, and then when they got governed by colonial masters, it became this one man being the head of state and head of everything. That has not changed in post-independence era because most of those states moved again into a one-party state where they look up to their president as the owner or leader or demigod that they have. Even when we talk about modern democratization, which has taken place in most of these countries, and you look at the constitutions, you realize that the president is given so much powers, enormous powers to think like, I decide who is a commissioner, who is this and this. So everybody's looking up to that one man who is the big man, and he has to do everything. And I think it's a very serious issue when we talk about devolution and diversity in terms of power allocation in Africa.
No, that's right. And actually, a lot of the conflicts are, based on that kind of division of state resources. We don't have anyone from Kenya this year.
No, we couldn't.
Yeah. But Kenya is kind of a classic case. As you know, there's been these huge ethnic conflicts between Kalenjin and Luo and Kikuyu and so forth. And what that's really about is that each one of these ethnic groups essentially wants to capture the state because then they can distribute the resources, of the state, to their supporters. And that's why these elections are so bitterly contested, because there's actually a lot of money and jobs and positions in the government at stake. And I think a lot of people looking at this would say that actually the ethnicity is just a kind of mobilizational tool, They're using, society and these markers of ethnicity as ways of getting at the state's resources, right? And that's why these conflicts end up, getting so bitter. Okay, I really got to get moving here. So now I'm treading on Eric's. So Eric will give you his own definition of the rule of law.
It's sacred ground you're treading on.
That'll be this afternoon. My definition of the rule of law is it's a set of rules that limit the ability of the state to do whatever it wants. As Eric will explain, there's many definitions of the rule of law that are out there, all of which are perfectly legitimate. So one definition is just law and order. You can walk down the street and not get attacked by a robber or something. It can mean a substantive view of human rights. So a lot of, Western human rights advocates would say if it doesn't have, equal treatment of women and minorities and so forth, it's not the rule of law. I prefer a more value-neutral definition, because actually there's a lot of different versions of law. But I would say that for me, as a political matter, what really matters is, does it limit the power of rulers to do whatever they want? And if the king, president, prime minister can make up the rules as he or she goes along, then it's not the rule of law. It has to be binding on the most powerful people in the society. And it's a separate institution. So already, we've only been talking about the state as a political institution. So as I said, the state is really about power. It's about the ability to concentrate and apply power. But then the rule of law is a constraint on power. It makes sure that when power is generated, that it's only used for, according to fairly transparent rules that people in the society agree upon. All right, and then we get to accountability. And I use the term accountability rather than democracy for a certain reason. Mark Plattner and I have had an argument about whether I'm using it in the right sense or not. But I could have used the word democracy there, but I think accountability is broader and in a way is more useful. Accountability simply means that the ruler acts on behalf of the community as a whole and not simply on his own behalf, right, or her own behalf. And I think that the form of accountability that we are most familiar with and which we're going to be teaching you about in the coming week is democratic accountability, which is a procedural form of accountability, meaning free and fair multi-party elections under rules that guarantee level playing field, open political competition, and so forth. And we're going to be much more precise in defining, the exact nature of those democratic institutions that, we believe are really constitute the foundations, the institutional foundations of a democracy. But I think that there's also a distinction to be made between procedural accountability, which is following those rules, and what I would call substantive accountability, meaning does the government actually do things that citizens want it to do, okay? So this is an interesting question. Is procedural accountability, does that always guarantee substantive accountability or not?
No.
Like, is it the case that if you follow, all of the recommended procedures for holding democratic elections, does that mean that the government will actually be truly accountable? Okay, why not?
The case of Egypt is maybe a good case now. What's happening in Egypt?
Okay.
They elected the government, but they decided to let it go.
Yeah. I mean, elections, as we'll see, are complicated signaling devices, and sometimes people can, vote for the wrong person. You need a certain level of voter education. People change their minds, and so forth. Furthermore, it is entirely possible for politicians to mobilize voters on, grounds that really aren't quite legitimate. So the Kenyan case we're talking about, Kenyans should not be going to the polls saying, I, as a Kikuyu, want Kikuyus to dominate the government, right? That's not really a legitimate way of thinking about modern democracy, and yet you can have a more or less free and fair election in which this happens because the mobilization is done on an ethnic basis or, something else. As we know, democratically elected governments can be highly corrupt, so all sorts of things can happen. We're going to get into this relationship about, democracy and corruption in much greater detail. Yeah.
No, you go first.
Just I wanted to share for Lebanon concerning, because you have a lot of confessions, and this is what's happening. Just like in elections, it's about confessions, and some people would even justify corruption in their own community because like the other did it. So I think the importance of accountability is about citizenship. It's about people taking their roles and doing it, and this is what's not happening, unfortunately.
Right.
And
right.
I wonder how to push them to do that. It's,
Right. So there's always going to be a little bit of a gap between the theory that says these procedures, meaning elections and free, the contest of ideas and all this stuff, how that actually translates into actual accountability on the part of the government. I mean, a lot of Americans would complain about the accountability of, government bureaucracies. Like, you've probably been following this NSA revelation that Edward Snowden, revealed, that it turns out that the NSA, contrary to what it was saying, is actually collecting all the emails of American citizens and so forth, even though they said that this wasn't the case. And in my mind, that's a case of failed accountability, because we have these special surveillance courts and we have congressional committees that are supposed to be watching this, and they weren't watching, So something failed in the accountability channel. So that's the only reason why I think that accountability, the word accountability should focus on the substantive dimension of accountability. Does the government actually truly reflect the wants and interests and needs and passions of its citizens, all right? And the way that we guarantee this in modern societies is through certain set of procedural rules that we identify with democracy, but there's a potential for a gap there. Yeah, Fernando.
I'm interested in that potential gap because it's very interesting that you don't use the word democracy and you use accountability. Does that mean that you believe in higher levels of political development without democratic accountability or with some other source
Okay,
of
this is going to be a
accountability?
sore point, right? Because, it's a very interesting question. Can an authoritarian country actually exercise a degree of substantive accountability even though it's not elected? And I think this is the same question as the one that Aristotle raised when he distinguished between a king and a tyrant, and basically what that means is the king actually cares about the interest of the whole community and the tyrant only cares about his own interest. And he said it's better to be a king than a tyrant. And so one of the issues that comes up in a country like China or Singapore is that they're just better run. They're not democracies, but in a sense, they're more responsive to citizen, wants and needs than, let's say, North Korea or Zimbabwe or other, kinds of. And Zimbabwe even, holds elections periodically. So it's so I would say that we really want procedural accountability, meaning free and fair multi-party elections, as a guarantee of substantive accountability. But it is possible that countries observing democratic procedures can fail in accountability, and it is also possible that authoritarian countries can be more or less accountable to their citizens through other means. I do not want to stress that this is an important route, and I don't want to try to justify China or Singapore or anybody else, but I think, that idea is out there. Yeah, Darko.
I was wondering, like, you're talking about substantive accountability, and you're talking about, like, justifying the reason for accountability. But for instance, Bosnia can pretty much relate to Lebanon or to Kenya in the case. And actually, how do you justify that, I don't know, voting on ethnicity in terms of power supremacy is not substantive accountability, because the people actually might just feel that that's the most important thing for them in terms of the government. For instance, in Bosnia, there's not even a translation of the word accountability in our language. So, like, you know, it's really hard to explain the concept, and that'd be my question. Like, how do you justify that that's not a viable?
Yeah, well, so that should lead then to a kind of rethinking about that political system. I mean, as I understand it, in Bosnia, you know, it was kind of a problem of the Dayton Accords, that because they were so interested in moving to quick elections to get the peace agreement, that they allowed the ethnic parties to dominate
and they do still
the electoral process, and they've been dominant, you know, ever since. And so what you really want is to try to figure out whether you can re-engineer that system to, you know, to create more modern parties that are not ethnically based. But yeah, so, I mean, again, so the formal procedures are a major way to get accountability, but they're no guarantee that that will actually happen. All right, so this is you know, one framework for thinking about development. So you've got economic growth, you've got social mobilization, and then you've got these three dimensions of political development. And as I said, the three dimensions are kind of balanced against each other. So you got the state on the one hand, which is all about concentrating and using power, and you've got the rule of law and accountability, democracy, we can call it democracy, that limit power, you know, that make sure that the government doesn't just do whatever it wants or act in its own self-interest and so forth. So, question is, so how are they related? And here's where there's been a lot of social science research over the last, you know, generation or so that tried to link these different dimensions of development to one another. And so so we already saw the first one, that how economic growth is related to social mobilization. That was the kind of classic 19th century social theory. A lot of economists have focused on the rule of law and public institutions like the state as being critical for economic growth. So why is the rule of law related to economic growth?
Property rights.
Property rights, okay, so economists love property rights, not just property rights, but also dispute resolution, contract enforcement, right? Nobody's going to invest in a country if they're worried that their investment is going to get expropriated the next year. And so property rights are extremely important in promoting long-term capital flows, investment. Again, long-term trade that we saw was really critical for growth is not going to happen if people have to worry about being cheated by somebody that, you know, who's not a cousin of theirs, right? And this is, I mean, long-term trade in Europe was actually done by, you know, different merchant families over long distances because there was no contract enforcement, and unless you're part of the same family, you couldn't trust the fact that you ordered something and it's delivered, you know, 6 months later, that it's actually going to show up. But under a modern contract enforcement system, you can go to a third party that is, you know, part of the state, that's the judiciary, and if you've got a business dispute, you take it to that party and they can enforce a decision if you've cheated a business partner. And by the way, one of the big problems that occurs in countries that do not have good contract enforcement and property rights is the growth of private militias. There is a theory about the origins of the mafia in Sicily. So the mafia didn't exist prior to the late 19th century, and it grew up in this very turbulent period. And one of the leading theories about why the mafia exists is that the state in Sicily and other parts of southern Italy was so weak that you could not reliably go to the courts in order to get a judgment against a business partner. And as a result, what you had to do was you hire a mafioso and you say, guy cheated me, go break his legs and get my money. And so the mafia guy goes there and he says, you know, you owe my client money, you better pay up, otherwise, bang. And Colombia, you know, I think same thing. I mean, you get private militias that, you know, the state is non-existent in large parts of rural Colombia, and so you get private enforcers and private protectors of property rights. And again, the mafia example shows why it's good to have a monopoly of, you know, of violence, because you know, the next thing that the mafia does after it protects your property rights is it protects your your business partner's property rights against you, and it engages in extortion and then drug peddling and prostitution and all these other things, right? So that's why you want this monopoly. But the weakness of the state and the weakness of the state's ability to enforce the rule of law is very detrimental to economic growth as a whole. And so I think those two arrows of causality are fairly well established. Social mobilization leading to accountability. Like, this is the classic, you know, route. I mean, obviously, if you get new groups, what they're going to do is demand representation in the political system. And so if you think about the history of Europe in the 19th century, a place like Britain, they go through the Industrial Revolution, they pull people off the countryside, they're now working in factories. Those people constitute a new industrial proletariat. They do not have the vote at the beginning of the 19th century, and gradually they start organizing. So what's the first thing they do to organize?
Unions.
Labor unions.
Labor unions, right. So the Trade Union Congress is founded in the late 19th century, and the first thing the Trade Union Congress does is to act politically, and they create a political wing which is known as the British Labour Party, which was founded in the year 1900. It represents such a large part. After the franchises expanded, it turns out that they're so numerous that they actually come to power for the first time in the 1920s. They completely displaced the old Liberal Party. So that's a case of economic growth producing a new division of labor, new forms of social mobilization that then get translated into greater political accountability. That's the way it's supposed to work. And in fact, a lot of the story about stable economic and political development has to do with that arrow over on the right part of the chart. Can you successfully translate a changing society into political participation, into accountable and representative political institutions? And if that's blocked, you know, if, for example, you've got a class of landed oligarchs that monopolize political power and they keep them out, then, you know, you're going to get instability. And so that's why I think in Argentina, you know, that's kind of the 1930 coup, that you have these old, you know, this class of big landowners, and they didn't like all this political mobilization, so they used the army to basically seize power and prevent that from, you know, from taking place. And so ideally what you'd like is for that arrow going from social mobilization to accountability to be a, you know, a one that welcomes participation and turns, you know, organizations of different sorts, labor unions, women's groups, you know, civil society organizations, turns them into representative political parties that then can contest elections and potentially have a share of power. That's the theory. That's the way that political development is supposed to work. And the fact that it doesn't work in very many countries really has to do with the fact that that channel is blocked. You know, that you get these newly mobilized groups and they're not allowed to participate, like Burma, right? So military government just sitting on, you know, access to political power for all of these years. And I think really now in Burma, you know, the issue is going to be
at the beginning, at the early stage of
yeah, and so now you've got to figure out how to, you know, get your society that's now mobilized and you know, modernizing in many ways. How do you get them represented in the political system? Oh, okay. So there's actually, yeah.
Before you proceed, can I have just a question? I just want to ask you about if you could elaborate more on how could the social mobilization and the rise of like civil society and interest groups, how could that also be a process of political decay? I didn't.
I'll get to that. I'll get to that.
No, is it the same thing as when he's saying that if the link between accountability, is that what's going to happen?
Yeah, so this is jumping ahead a couple of slides, but Samuel Huntington, who wrote about this back in the 1960s, said that political decay can happen when you get a lot of social mobilization that is blocked and does not get represented in the political system.
So it's the same.
And so that could then lead to instability, coups, conflict, and so forth. Okay? Yes?
So from your diagram, can we infer that there won't be civil society development without economic growth?
No. You can have, well, it's one of those things that it's not dependent on economic growth, but economic change, generally speaking, does foster the growth of what we call civil society. Because if you go to Papua New Guinea or, a kind of very traditional agrarian society, you have kinship groups, you have religious organizations, but except for the cities, you don't have modern civil society because civil society is pretty largely an urban phenomenon. And so if you haven't had widespread urbanization, you don't have the resources. For example, civil society requires a surplus of, someone's got to pay, your salaries, and you've got to have the organizational ability. And if you're living as a peasant in the countryside, it's really hard to do that. So it's not dependent, you can have, and they've got civil society in Papua New Guinea. I mean, Papua New Guinea has some small cities, and so they have environmental and women's groups and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, the richer and more developed the society, the more opportunities there are for different forms of civil society organizations. And interesting thing, now in China is that you're getting a civil society appearing now that, Chinese are getting richer and, better educated and so forth. So let me just, we got 15 minutes. So.
Sorry. So from the paper that I read, you said that, the understanding is that rule of law is very important in the dimension of development and for the political development. However, you also mentioned in your paper that rule of law is a kind of a spandrel. Can you explain further on that? That is it something which just came out of nowhere, or are we to take it that is very important right from the beginning?
Well, this is kind of a historical issue, but what I was arguing in one of my books was that if you looked at the origin of the rule of law, it actually historically comes out of religion. That's really the source of rules in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Hinduism. That's the source of laws that limit the power of the state. And eventually, as these societies modernized, you develop a modern set of laws that are not linked to religion overtly. But that's why I called it, a spandrel is just an architectural, it's a part of a dome that looks like a triangle, and it wasn't actually designed. It's just a junction of two, other elements, and nobody designed it, but, once the dome's in place, you've got these little triangles there. And so that's why I was saying that the rule of law, in some sense, when God gave Moses, the tablets on Mount Sinai, he wasn't saying, we need a modern rule of law so we can have property rights and investment. I mean, God just did it for his own purposes. But there you have it. You've got a law that actually gets enforced. Okay, so let me just, I got to speed up a little bit here. So I mentioned that there's actually this sixth dimension, which has to do with ideas and legitimacy. In a lot of social science, they don't pay attention. I mean, they just look at economic incentives and the like. But I think that this is a completely separate dimension of development. Ideas just, they're influenced by these other boxes, but they also have a life of their own. And so the growth of the idea of human equality was one of those ideas that Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, that it's been relentless over the last few centuries. And now, if you get up in a, public forum anywhere and you say, well, I think, certain class of citizens should have deliberately less political rights than another class, you're not going to get very far. Whereas in the 19th century, you could make that argument, you know, in the most developed countries in Europe, you could make that argument, you know, without any embarrassment. And so, you know, so ideas change, and then they're related to, you know, they're related to other dimensions of development. So laws are respected when they have a certain status, you know, and again, this is why religion is important as a source of law, because religion is a set of ideas that gives legitimacy to law in a way that humanly devised laws oftentimes can't. If you say that God, the source of these laws is God, it's just got a different status from saying, well, we just made it up and passed these rules in Congress. Yes?
So if you look at the world religions, which religion most promotes democracy and development?
So that is a question that is impossible to answer because all religious systems are highly complex bodies of ideas, and they evolve over time. And so, you know, right now there's a high correlation between democracy and Western Christianity, okay? But if you roll the clock back, you know, 500 years, Catholic Church was one of the biggest opponents of democracy, right? And, you know, in the United States before the Civil War, Christianity was used to defend slavery, you know, human slavery. And so I just think that, you know, there's a certain essential core of teachings in most major religions that projects itself, you know, over time, but every group of religious ideas is subject to interpretation. And I guess one of the big issues right now, you know, going on in the Muslim world is, you know, are you going to take, you know, the ideas of the Prophet and you know, the Holy Quran, and are you going to interpret them in a, you know, very strict kind of medieval way, or are you going to try to interpret them in a way that's compatible with, you know, more liberal ideas, you know, associated with modern societies? And that's a big fight that's going on, but I don't think the outcome of that is predetermined. You know, and in fact, it's actually a political struggle, because a lot of times if it's in people's self-interest to interpret ideas in a certain way, you know, they'll figure out a way of doing that. So that's a way of dodging your question and not actually coming up with an answer. Okay, so rule of law, you know, the state is obviously legitimated by certain ideas. Nationalism, right? Nationalism is a big temptation for everybody because that's what gives legitimacy to the state. The state says, I am the representative of, you know, a certain group, collectivity. People are going to obey it more than if it just says, well, I'm here to protect your economic interests. And then, you know, ideas affect social mobilization. So think about feminism, gay rights, civil rights movement. All of these were founded on certain ideas that people had about equality and the right of different groups in the society to participate. And a lot of the change that was, you know, I think that the arrow of causality really goes from the ideas to the social change rather than the other way around. Okay, how am I doing? 10 minutes. Oh, accountability, right, so democracy, yeah. Okay, so this is the complicated chart we end up with at the end of this discussion. So there's 6 boxes, 6 independent dimensions of development, and the reason why it's important to distinguish them is that you can have development in any one of these 6 boxes independently of the others, all right? And we can actually think of countries that are much more developed in one dimension, but not at all in another. So where would you put a country like Afghanistan?
Not in the paradigm, not here.
Well, I mean, they've got a lot of social mobilization, actually, right, in a certain way. Well, they have some degree of democracy, you know. I mean, the elections may be rigged, but they actually hold elections, which North Korea doesn't, right? So you got to give them credit for that. So in that democracy box, they're developed. The state is pretty non-existent in many parts of Afghanistan. The rule of law, again, a lot of American groups, including Eric's, have been trying to build a rule of law. And so Eric, how would you say the rule of law is doing in Afghanistan today?
Not well.
Not well.
Especially if you're looking at the fundamental dimension that you point out, the Constitution constraining leaders. It's not going very well.
Yeah. Right, so that's a case where you've got democracy, but those other two political dimensions are, are weak. Economic growth is pretty weak, and so the sources of social change over time, it's not really clear where it's going to come from. Singapore, where does Singapore belong in this?
Rule of law.
Okay, got a strong rule of law.
Economic growth.
All about democracy.
The
Got a
state.
strong state.
Legitimacy.
But in the democracy category, they don't. They hold elections, but they're pretty much rigged. But they've got strong economic growth. And then one of the questions in Singapore is, as they get richer and there's more social mobilization, is that eventually going to increase demands for democracy? How about Russia? Where does Russia fit?
State.
Dennis.
State.
Okay, it's got a really, it had a weak state in the 1990s, but it's now been restored. Rule of law.
Economic growth.
Social mobilization would go there.
They've got economic growth.
Social mobilization. There is a huge social mobilization.
Yeah, there's social mobilization going on, and so a lot of the opponents of President Putin are urban, middle class, educated people. His support base are more rural people that live in smaller cities, kind of deindustrialized areas, and so forth, right? So there's social mobilization, and there's democracy. It's not a level playing field. It's, he prevents free and fair competition, but, they do hold elections, and if you believe, some of the polling, he's popular among a number of Russians, all right? So the point of all of this is that you can locate any country within this matrix of 6 dimensions of development. And one thing that you ought to think about in each of your individual countries is where you locate your society in this matrix. What are the dimensions where it's strong and where is it weak? And I think this is a helpful exercise to go through when you think about strategy, because in some countries, you may be blocked in one dimension and you're not going to make much progress, and so maybe there's another approach that you can take, because in a sense, all 6 of these really have to develop if you want to have a fully modernized society, and they can all develop separately from one another, although there are these kinds of relationships. So when we get into the discussion of democracy, actual democratic institutions, this is going to be the critical connection. So remember, I showed you that there's a line connecting social mobilization, and now I've replaced accountability with democracy. So we'll talk about, full procedural democracy. And there are these intermediate groups that are critical in making this connection, and this is where you guys fit in, right? So from society to democratic accountability, you've got basically 2 forms of organization, which is civil society and political parties, all right? Because both of these groups claim to represent the interest of different parts of society, or the whole of society in many cases, and they're the ones that try to impact the nature of the political system. And so one of the key questions is, how do you translate forces in society into actual political action? And I would say that one of the weaknesses of many new democracies is actually that there's a lot of civil society that is active and can actually bring down tyrannical governments, as we just saw in Tunisia and Egypt. But what they're not necessarily great at doing is what political parties do, which is to be able to contest elections, come to power, and then actually exercise power. And that connection is one that I think has been a kind of persistent failure of a lot of democratic activists. Like Egypt is a great case of this. So Egypt, you had Tahrir Square, the whole Arab Spring that mobilized. So just think about what happened in Egypt. Prior to January of 2011, people said, oh, the Arabs, they're passive, they accept authority, they'll just go along with any kind of dictator. And so the Arabs proved them wrong, and they proved them wrong precisely in that social mobilization box. Arab people can get mad at their government just as much as any other people in any other part of the world. And they've got a very powerful civil society. What they've been much less successful at doing, at least the more liberal groups, is in translating that kind of mobilization and activism into a party that can contest an election and win an election. And that's where the Muslim Brotherhood had them beat, because the Muslim Brotherhood was good at organization. They're really good at going out into the countryside and getting people to vote and to the polling place and so forth. And this is, Samuel Huntington, my teacher, said this a long time ago. Students are really bad at this kind of activity. Students don't know how to go out and talk to peasants and say, we'll put you in buses and get you to the polling place on election day, and this is the agenda that we're going to follow. And so, since many of you represent civil society groups, I think this is an important dimension that you need to think about carefully, is how you translate your particular form of activism into actual, formal participation. Well, okay, so some of you live in countries that don't have democracy at all, so there you got a different problem of getting the dictator out of the way and getting representative institutions. Those of you that live in countries with formal democratic institutions and procedures, there I think the critical question is, how do you translate society via civil society into actually real political participation, by which I mean seats in parliament, ministries, some ability to actually influence public policy. Because if you don't make that final step, what you're going to end up with is either domination by other parties that are better organized than you, or you're just going to get stuck with authoritarian government. And so I think a lot of what we're going to talk about, when we talk about more of the nuts and bolts of democratic activism, has to do with those kinds of issues. So I'm at the end of my time. I actually have just a couple of. Okay, so this is an example of a country where everything across these 6 boxes, 6 dimensions, actually work together and were mutually supportive. So South Korea in 1954 had just signed an armistice at the end of the Korean War. Its per capita income was lower than that of the then Belgian Congo. And actually people at that time thought that the Belgian Congo, because it had lots of diamonds and copper and other things, would actually do better than South Korea, right? So in 40 years, South Korea rises to be the 12th largest industrial economy in the whole world. And they do this not actually because of the rule of law, but they've got a coherent state. They inherit a state, it's a kind of traditional Confucian state that modernizes, run by a lot of technocrats. They get a lot of economic growth. It leads to social mobilization. So Korea in 1954 is an agrarian society where probably 80% of the population works on farms. By the 1980s, the proportion is reversed. Like 80% live in cities, 20% live in the countryside. So it's largely become an urban industrial society. There's now civil society groups, church groups, there's labor unions, there's students, there's all these new civil society groups. So that's number 3, arrow number 3. Social mobilization then in 1987 leads to the downfall of the last military dictator, president, and the opening up of presidential elections to democratic contestation. And then by the 1990s, Parliament, or the Korean Congress, is fully democratically elected. And then that goes on to support rule of law and the legitimacy of the Korean state. And so this is a case where there's a happy story that all of these different dimensions of development worked together and produced change in all 6 dimensions of development, okay? But not every story is happy.
But it took also time.
Well, it took, yeah, although, so how long did it take for Denmark to go from being a Viking kingdom to being, what it is today? Well, that was, 6 or 7 centuries, and Korea did it in 40 years. So, yeah, it's 40 years, but that's pretty damn fast, actually, okay? So this is the story about that I was telling you with regard to Huntington. So the dotted lines are cases where the causality works in a negative way, where actually change in one box leads to a deterioration in one of the other boxes. And what he was arguing was that a lot of times excessive social mobilization, which is not accommodated by increasing participation, can undermine the legitimacy of the state, it can undermine rule of law, it can have a lot of negative consequences for the stability of the society as a whole. And if you get like Bolivia is a really great case of this, because Bolivia, it's a strange country, it's very poor, it's got a big indigenous population, but it's one of the most hyper-mobilized countries because they've got a large mining industry. And so they've had labor unions and activists and so forth. And for an extended period in their history, they went from one military coup to another because these hyper-mobilized people, every time they didn't like a president, they'd march to La Paz and they'd unseat him. And actually, Evo Morales now had one of the longest presidencies in modern Bolivian history because he's kind of gotten on top of a lot of those hyper-mobilized groups, right? So mobilization doesn't always lead to political stability. Russia, okay, well this is the 1900s, but there it seemed to me that, the 1990s, so it seemed to me with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a big change in ideas that led then to a weakening of the state, but it also led to the creation of democratic institutions, and reacting to that state weakness gives you Mr. Putin, who then wants to push the clock backwards in terms of restoring the power of the state. And now we've got a state, we've got some limited degree of democracy, and we have very little rule of law. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this little picture. So one of the questions I'm going to get into in some of my subsequent talks is just within the 3 political dimensions. We tend to emphasize rule of law and democracy a lot as constraints on state power. But in my view, one of the big failings of a lot of new democracies is that they do not construct effective states. And by effective states, I don't mean states that have got a lot of policemen and that can crack heads and arrest journalists and put their political competitors in jail. That's one form of state strength that I think is a kind of negative one. What I mean by state strength is, can you effectively educate your children? Can you provide health services? Can you provide citizen security so people can go to work? And can you provide public, electricity, water? Do you have the right policies that promote economic development? That's what I mean by the appropriate degree of state strength. And I think if you don't pay attention to that, then you're going to end up in trouble. And so, as I said, these 3 dimensions really need to be balanced against, balanced against one another appropriately. And so if you only have the constraints, if you only got law and democracy, but you don't have a state that can actually effectively do things, you're going to end up in trouble. And so I think in a country like Burma, that's something important to think about, because you've had a state that's repressively strong. It's been really good at jailing, people like you. It's not been terribly effective at providing economic growth or public services, right? And if in the next few years, the Burmese opposition actually comes into power so that they're running the state. You know, if the opposition cannot run the state effectively to actually provide some of those services, then it's going to delegitimate the whole process of democratization, right? So this is something I think that's, you know, extremely important to keep in mind, that you also need a state that is, and so the question is not the state versus rule of law and democracy, it's having all three of them at the same time held in some kind of balance. You don't want a state that is unaccountable, has too much discretion, basically does whatever it wants. But on the other hand, if you have a state that's too weak, you're also not going to be in a good spot either. Okay, yes.
Yeah. I was looking at your diagram, and I was thinking, where would geopolitical developments fit in it? Because if you take chances of Baltic countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, their chances of becoming a democratic state would not be compared with the chances of like Caucasian countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. So where would this
you know, this is a question I think that Steve Krasner will address more, because that's what he works on, is external or international influences on the development of institutions. And so, you know, you can see from like this basic chart that any one of those boxes can be affected by international forces. So ideas is one of the, you know, that's what the internet's all about, and modern communications, is that ideas flow across borders very, very rapidly. In terms of social mobilization, you have big movements of population, you have diaspora communities, you have, you know, migrants and so forth. Obviously, in terms of economic growth, that's highly dependent on how integrated you are into the global economy. And then, you know, people imitate institutions from other countries. And so, you know, when Europe developed democratic institutions, nobody had really done it before, or the United States. And so it was kind of a trial and error process. But now if you want to set up a free and fair election, you know, you've got an international community that knows how to monitor elections and how to make sure the playing field is reasonably equal and so forth. And so there's a lot of, so this diagram, you know, in fairness, really needs to be supplemented by a lot of arrows coming from the outside that also affect development along each of these dimensions. Yeah.
Frank, I don't understand very well why you are using alternatively democracy and accountability. Because personally, I thought that accountability was one of the pillars of democracy. That's one. And second, when you're talking about accountability, you tend to focus only on rulers. And I also think that we need to focus on the accountability of the citizens themselves. I have not heard you talking about this dimension.
Yes, okay. So I think, as I said, you can define accountability and democracy in different ways. The only reason I was distinguishing between the two was that, in my view, accountability had to do with the substantive responsiveness of a government to its citizens. Now, it is true that citizens have obligations towards each other and towards the state, which we can talk about. I think we'll have to elaborate on that, you know, at a later point. But the fundamental theory about democratic government is the government is based on consent of the governed. It reflects the interests of, you know, of the citizens. And all I was trying to do in making that distinction is to distinguish between the formal procedures that we use in modern democracies to produce substantive accountability. And all I was saying is that the two are not necessarily the same, all right? That you can get adherence to the formal procedures and still not end up with truly accountable government. But alternatively, you can actually violate the procedures and still have some degree of accountability. But the overlap between the two is very large. So essentially, you know, I'm pretty much using accountability and democracy as interchangeable terms. Yeah, Fernando.
I think the distinction is very important, and I think we should discuss more in the next classes, because I think the substantial definition of accountability will open the door to some of the theories and ideas, especially in some countries in Latin America, where you have some presidents expressing that they are being accountable to the public, accountable to the citizens. You have Bolivia, Ecuador, in some way Argentina too, without following all the restrictions and provisions of the constitutional democracy as we know it. And I think this is a key issue to discuss, to what extent the constitutional democracy in some middle-income countries is still the framework for good government and a substantial accountability to the public.
I do not want to be a big defender of substantive accountability at the expense of democratic procedure, because I really do think that if you don't have the procedures, in the long run, you're not going to get to substantive accountability. But it's a challenge that's out there, because there are some authoritarian countries that are run very effectively. Like Rwanda is a great case of that, right? So there's a lot of complaints from the democracy community about the way Paul Kagame runs Rwanda, but if you look in terms of development outcomes, it's doing pretty well. And the same thing with China, Singapore, you know. And so I think unless we confront these, you know, these cases and talk about them, you're missing part of the story. And like I said, I don't want to be the defender of any of these particular societies, but I do think that one of the big failings of many formal democracies is their failure to deliver on substantive accountability. And so unless you can solve that problem, I think you're gonna, you'll have problems. So